So this video is all about the process of converting between fractions and decimals, and specifically we're going to talk about the direction of converting from a fraction to a decimal. And before we can get into the idea of converting between fractions and decimals, we have to talk a little bit about what fractions and decimals mean and some of the characteristics that they have. So go ahead and pause the video and write down a few things that are true about fractions, what they mean, what they look like, what they're made up of, etc. And the same thing about decimals, and unpause when you are ready to move on. So a few things that you might have noticed are true about fractions is that there's a numerator or a denominator. They're used to represent a unique part of a whole set. You could have talked about the fraction bar, which of course is a bar between the numerator and denominator. All of those things are true about a fraction. As far as decimals are concerned, we can talk about the fact that they're based on the same place value that our regular numbers are. It breaks down information into tenths, hundredths, etc. But the key thing that's true about decimals and fractions is that they are both used to represent a part of a whole set. Decimals use it based on place value. Fractions represent that based on a part and a whole, or in the ratio between two numbers, which we'll talk about a little bit later this year. So if they both represent a partial value, or not quite a whole value at times, then they can both potentially be used to represent the same part of a whole value. And if they can represent the same part of the whole value, for example, like 1/2 and 5, then we can convert between them. So if they can be used to represent the exact same thing, this is one of the fundamental ideas in math. It's one of the things that we rely on when we talk about equations. It's one of the things we rely on when we talk about equal signs, is that if two values, if two expressions, if two forms can be used to represent the exact same thing, then we can convert between them. And so let's talk about what it means to convert between fractions and decimals, specifically starting with a fraction. And in order to understand what it means to start with a fraction, we have to remember what the other meaning of the fraction bar is. Not just that it's numerator over denominator, numerator pieces out of a total of denominator pieces. What is the other meaning of a fraction bar? For example, if the fraction were 4/2, how else would we represent that? Go ahead, pause the video, sketch down an idea of what you think that is, and come back when you are ready to move on. So when we first talked about order of operations earlier in the year, we talked about how the fraction bar, where we have a long expression in the numerator and a long expression in the denominator, actually means divided by. And so if we use that idea for a fraction like 1/2 and talk about it as the fraction bar meaning divided by, then we can understand how to convert between fractions and decimals, because we know that that means numerator divided by denominator, or in this case, 1 divided by 2. Not the way you normally hear that in lower school or elementary school, where you'd have a larger value divided by a smaller value, but both are totally acceptable. When we have a smaller value divided by a larger value, that just means we're going to end up with a decimal if we're dividing using that decimal algorithm that we're familiar with. So if that were what we were wanting to do, 1/2, 1 divided by 2, we would have to make sure that 1 as the numerator, as the dividend, is inside this division operation sign, the box or the house or whatever it is that you want to call it, that you've called it before, and that the 2 as the denominator or the divisor is outside the house. So the denominator is always the divisor, and the numerator is always the dividend, because it's always numerator divided by denominator. And we should get an answer that is less than 1. So now when we divide this, we'll have to go back to understanding and remembering what it means to do decimal division. We have 1 divided by 2. 2 does not go into 1, so we'll have to add a decimal place and a 0, because we can keep adding zeros as long as we want. And 2 does go into 10 5 times, with a remainder of 0, so we're done. So 1/2 as a decimal converts to 0.5. And that's exactly what it means to convert from a fraction to a decimal anyway, and that's the process we follow. To convert from a fraction to a decimal, we just divide the denominator into the numerator until the decimal either ends or repeats. That is, numerator divided by denominator, denominator divided into numerator. Two ways of saying the same thing. So first, go ahead and pause the video. Write down all the things that are starred, which is pretty much everything that you see on this slide, and come back when you are ready to move on to a few new things. So for example, if our fraction was 3/4, numerator divided by denominator, so numerator divided by denominator, denominator into numerator. 4 doesn't go into 3, so we need to add a decimal there. 4 goes into 37 times, becomes 28, drop into 0. 4 goes into 25 times. So 4, or rather 3/4, is the same as the decimal 0.75, which is something we're familiar with. All of those conversions and those same meanings between things like 1/4 and 0.25, 1/10 and 0.1, 1/100th and 0.01, all of those things that we know to be true from our previous years in school are still going to be true when we're converting between fractions and decimals. And it's helpful to know some of those things and to use them as the basis for talking about the rest of it. So before we go on to doing some practice problems here, we have to talk about a little bit of terminology, because at the end of this definition here, it says the decimal either ends or repeats. And that gets to the idea that there are a few different types of decimals that we could have. And there are two that we're going to talk about right now. A terminating decimal is a decimal that ends. So if you divide the denominator into the numerator of the fraction, you end with a remainder of 0. Terminating decimals being things like 0.7, 0.000000318, 1.6, 12 even is a terminating decimal because the decimal value ends. All of those different types of things. So go ahead, pause the video, write down the definition of a terminating decimal, come back when you're ready to move on. And so obviously not every decimal is necessarily going to terminate, because as part of that explanation of how to divide fractions into decimals, or change fractions into decimals rather, we said that the decimal either ends or repeats. So one of the options, if the decimal doesn't end somewhere, is for the decimal to repeat. And in a repeating decimal, it's one where the digits begin repeating without end. And when we say without end, we literally mean that the decimal never stops. And that's, for example, like 0.33333, on and on and on and on, so that there is never a final 3. That is called a repeating decimal. And we're only going to look at terminating decimals in terms of our fraction to decimal conversions in this video, because when we get to class the next time that you have class, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about repeating decimals, how we recognize repeating decimals, is there an option for a decimal neither to be terminating nor repeating, all of those types of questions. So go ahead, write down this definition also, because that's going to be important after class, and come back when you're ready to do some practice problems. So we have 4 practice problems for you to work on in terms of converting between fractions and decimals. 2 on this page and 2 on the next. Remember that the idea between converting between fractions and decimals is that you start with the fraction, divide numerator divided by denominator, and then that will give you your decimal. So go ahead, pause the video, work on these conversions, numerator divided by denominator, and come back when you're ready to move on. So this is 17 divided by 50, 17 divided by 50. That's what 17/50ths means. 50 doesn't go into 17, but it does go into 173 times. Add another 0, keep going, and 50 goes into 204 times. So our decimal version of 17/50ths is 0.34. Now for 9/16ths, 9 divided by 16, this is going to go on for a little bit longer. 16 goes into 9 6 times. Actually, rather, it doesn't go in 6 times, it goes in 5 times. 16 times 5 is 80. Add another 0. Goes into 100 6 times. 16 times 6 is 96. Drop that, that's a 4. Another 0. Goes into 42 times to make 32. Another 0, remainder of 8, drop the 0, and now that goes in 5 times. 5 times 16 is 80, and that's where we end. 9/16 is 0.5625. Last 2 practice problems, go ahead, pause the video, and come back when you're ready to move on. So for 2 and 4/25, we can either convert it to an improper fraction, or we can just convert the 4/25 part, because we know the whole number value is going to be 2. So 25 goes into 40 once. Subtraction is 16, goes into 156 times, which is 150. So our decimal value is 2.16. And then for 1/8, 1 divided by 8 goes into 10 once, goes into 20 twice. Subtraction gives you a 4, goes into 45 times, 0.125. So that's it for our video for converting fractions to decimals. Divide the denominator into the numerator, or rather divide the numerator by the denominator, and then you will come up with the decimal version of the fractions. In class tomorrow, again, we'll talk about what a repeating decimal is, how we recognize a repeating decimal as a part of the conversion, and also if there is an option for a decimal other than terminating and repeating.